Welcome to this video, created from a live webinar we broadcast on June the 30th covering trade and transaction reporting, what good can come of it. This is part 1, which covers the search for benefits from trade reporting, the hub concept, a poll asking has trade reporting benefited your firm, and market feedback. Our speakers today are Brian Lynch, CEO of Riskfocus, Steve French, Head of Regulatory Services for Triana, Chris Barnes, Writer and Analyst for Claris FT, and Gavin Dixon, a Senior Executive and ex-COO of Credit Trading at BNP Paribas. We hope you enjoyed the video.
So I'm going to hand over to Brian Lynch, CEO of Riskfocus, and he's going to set the scene and begin the conversation.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks to the OTC space for hosting this webinar for us, and thanks very much for my fellow panelists for joining in. We really wanted to try and do a positive webinar. Having been in a lot of conferences and webinars on this topic of trade and transaction reporting, it seems most seem to be lamenting the burden of regulatory reporting. The industry has invested millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in building out infrastructure to satisfy various jurisdictional trade reporting requirements. And for the most part, we see people treating this as a regulatory tax with very little expectation of benefit, if any at all. That's not true 100%, but by and large, that's the way we see it back from clients. On the other side, the vendors and the service providers like ourselves obviously see an opportunity to help the banks, but we also think there's a real opportunity for the market to be got from the centralization of data and from the quality of data that should be created out of this process. You can imagine the reduced cost of integration where services that typically are applied against multiple internal and proprietary third-party APIs can now be applied against a standardized set of data in a standard format, which means any client that buys that service immediately can take advantage of it if their data is sitting in the trade repository. So the big question here is, whilst I know from experience and having done some of the initial discussions around this topic, we're not expecting to hear a massive positive outcome in terms of people's perceptions of trade reporting yet. But the questions I would ask is why not? When organizations have built an infrastructure like I've got up on the slide here, where they've had to rationalize all of their flows, front to back, take all of the asset classes and put that data in a standardized format into a central trade repository, why aren't we seeing more benefits, and why isn't there an expectation from the folks who are making these investments to get more out of the process? And I think that we should start driving that conversation positively, because the event or the result of that will be an improvement in the data quality. When people know that there actually is a real use to this data and feel there's a value to it, there'll be a knock-on impact on quality and a knock-on impact on the process. So that's how I'd like to open the conversation, and I'm sure we're going to have some healthy debate about these topics.
Sorry, this is Steve French at Triana. So these things initially were looked at as pockets, and we're coming to that in more detail. So you started with one jurisdiction, and there wasn't a big thinking plan about it. And we know that the data, a lot of the data, this is where Chris can come in later on, that was made available, it wasn't really appreciated, the quality of that data and what was looked at. And then when we moved on to EMEA, again, it was looked on as a bolt-on activity, the EMEA reporting. So, and we will cover this again in more detail. I think it's only now that there's the opportunity to take that step back, as Brian was saying, and actually review the data that's available.
Yeah, this is Chris at Claris. I'd completely agree with that. One thing I'd add to that is that obviously with the US transaction reporting, the data being made available at a transaction level, it leads to quite a positive reinforcement process, actually. We see it with a couple of the Claris products, such as CEFU, where the CEFs themselves are benchmarking themselves as part of market share. When there is something wrong with that data, it's very, very clear to the whole market, and there's a feedback mechanism there. Sadly, with EMIR reporting, that's not really happening yet. But if the transaction level details do become available, then undoubtedly the quality of the data gets better.
Has trade reporting benefited your firm? And we've given you a scale of answers, which is, not at all, quite a lot, a little, or something else.
What does that tell us?
Well, the more or less 70% of people say that it's either had no benefit or a tiny amount. So there's two bars in the middle. So
I think that's a glass half full approach. I think 70% of it say yes, it had some benefit.
Ever the optimist.
Yeah, that's more positive than I was expecting. Actually, it's the majority are saying yes, there is some benefit to come from it.
It's Gavin Dixon here for those that don't know the voice. I spoke to a number of large institutions and smaller institutions to get sort of direct feedback around this, and the general theme of answer was the larger institutions were kind of more on the negative side and the smaller institutions on the more positive side. And I think there's a bit of history that goes with that. And if you look at the larger firms, especially say the what were they, the G14 banks or whatever, that originally had the commitments to do various things from the US Fed around confirm matching and so forth, and also reporting to the trade information warehouse on the credit side, and the creation of something similar originally with Optima and then latterly with DTCC over the years. And those business lines, the credit business line and then the rates business line, all kind of did that up front off the back of their trading platform in a sort of a trade reporting mode. You go further down the line and you had to add some more data, so they've sort of plugged that on. And so you've got a very fragmented setup in the larger institutions. I think that the smaller institutions starting a little later have seen, we've got all these products to have to report on, all these transactions, all these pieces of information. So they've had an opportunity to step back and think about how it might be best to do that. Hence, they're in a better position. One of the larger institutions that I spoke to said that benefits, nothing at this point in time, but they did come out and then say that the delay in MiFID implementation out to January 18 has given them an opportunity to take a step back and see if they can rationalize some of the data around counterparties and product identifiers and everything, and make it a little more streamlined. They've got so much to unpick that it's a massive task, and whether they, in this day and age, actually have the budget to do a lot of that is a question mark. But I think there's at least visible signs that institutions are starting to realise that they have to decentralise the information. And I think that there's a further slide sort of on the next page that then goes into what you can kind of think about if you centralise data. All of the things around the wheels on the end of these spokes can be delivered from a central repository of data internally within firms. Hard to get to from a fragmented place, but if you implemented something up front, then you're in a better position. So I think that's the essence of what we're going to talk about today. In reality, is to what does utopia look like, and perhaps some of the steps that people might have to think about to get to there. So
so do we think that it's an interesting point, right? Imagine you've got a single source for all the relevant data for these functions. Do we think that firms are actually going that way?
I think bigger firms are trying to do something similar internally. For me, what's interesting is that this data is being housed, a lot of it housed in places like the DTCC, and so my thinking is that if the market was intent on making the most of this data, that's the place they could get it from. They could get it from there are multiple repositories, but it's still a better sort of rationalized set of data that they could start to put services around and utilities around. What's interesting, I think, is that the DTCC is constrained from commercializing the data, and if anything, that might be holding back some of the opportunity. And I think the market was very quick with that. They were concerned with putting all this data in one place that there's a potential that they could lose control of it, and And so that's why the DTCC was one of the was chosen as the primary repository for most of the biggest firms, but they're restricted from doing much more with it, and I think that's a mistake. I think if the market came together and said, let's do more with this data, let's allow these repositories to do more that brings value back to us, then it'll stop just being a tax and they'll get more out of it. And there's so much out there that could be put into utilities now. There's so much, we're in a much more sort of flow-oriented world where commoditization means there's not a lot of proprietary value to be gained from functions that banks used to do themselves. And they're much better off, mutualizing the cost in a central utility. I saw a recent article from Quartet FS about the fundamental review of the trading book and running the standardized model approach on data. Again, running that on a central set of data would allow everyone to implement that FRTB in a much more cost-effective way than trying to do it themselves and run parallel risk processes on their own data. So those are the kind of ideas I think we should be starting to think about. And as Gavin says, people have to fix the process first to make sure the data is right before they actually get value from it.
You've started to see some of the back office services in some institutions, mainly around futures at this point, but I'm sure broadening, others have had a go at it in the past. But if you start outsourcing some of those services to a central provider, then centralizing the data with it would ease some of these other functions in terms of delivery of information.
To give a personal perspective, I was involved in building the DTCC trade warehouse and trade repository, which went from being a simple sort of confirmation matching service to becoming an end-to-end processing platform. And at the time, the banks bought into the fact that a centralized platform, because credit derivatives, the processes around them were not very well coordinated, in particular for secondary trading.
But it was more driven by default management and stuff as well around the credit stuff.
But there was such complication about how these were supposed to work that I remember getting people in a room, asking them a simple question about how one of these events worked. And we had 50% voting one way, 50% the other. So half the market had a fundamental disagreement about how they worked. So we built it into the warehouse and we linked it with CLS and it became an end-to-end. It's almost unique. It's the only industry utility end-to-end that you could in effect put your trades in and get them settled.
I think the other thing that Gavin touched on is you have to break down who we're talking about. So it's very easy to say the banks, and then you've got the tier ones, the tier twos, and the buy side. And from our sort of perspective, it boils down to three sort of types. There's those that are still and have said from day one, that's all very interesting, but does it make me solve my regulatory obligations? And that's all that's the focal point. Then there's those that are saying, well, it's new opportunity, and this is across some of the banks and the buy sides as well, and we'll take a step back. And as we can see on the diagram, you start breaking into risk and collateral management and compression and clearing and settlement, and we're going into more detail on that. And then there's the banks, which is where Gavin was going with this, which is they sort of tried to do this previously, and a long time before the Dodd-Frank Act, and now they're revisiting what they tried to do previously, and it's a whole new bunch of people who again using terms like middleware and data bus, which I think we're all old enough here to remember that the first time around, but they're being used as new terms. And Bill, you're probably nearly as old as me on this, so you've lived this once again.
Mudslinging already.